Good evening, everyone. Let's just take a minute to let people get seated and settled, and then we'll begin our program. So I'm Patrick Malloy. I am the Dean of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and for those of you who are not familiar with the Anglican dialect, that means I am the CEO and the senior priest here at the cathedral. So on behalf of all of us who work and worship in this place, as well as all of the Episcopalians in the Diocese of New York, and especially Matthew Hyde, our bishop, I want to welcome all of you here tonight. This is really an honor for us that you are with us. This cathedral began in the 19th century during a time of great immigration here in the city of New York. And the building was built with that in mind. In many ways, the building came out of that reality. For those of you who have not been here before, I would certainly ask you sometime to come back and just wander around. And behind me, there are 7 apsidal chapels, and each one is dedicated to a nationality group that was immigrating to the United States in the 19th century. So this place was conceived as a center for many, many people of many nationalities and language to find home. I don't know if this is true, but I've heard it said, and I know that Anglicans can be presumptuous enough that this may very well be true, that somehow they imagined that people would come to the United States and they would gather in their various nationality groups back there in those chapels for their services and things. But then eventually they would learn English, come to their senses, come out into the room here, worship in English as Anglicans. Now, I can tell you that did not happen. But there is still, nonetheless, baked into this place a notion that this is to be a gathering place for people of all sorts. And it was also built at a time when there was a resurgence of interest in ecumenism, in relationship between various Christian traditions, and in some way a hope for reunification. And so for us to have you here tonight, people from many nations, I'm sure, both here in the room and online, as well as people who are here to celebrate the renaissance of a great Roman Catholic cathedral, almost as important as this place. We are just delighted that the cathedral, in a way, is living up to what it was intended to be, a gathering place for people of many nations, and as our charter says, a place that would foster Christian unity. It was also founded, in addition, of course, to being the seat of the Bishop of New York, it was also founded to be a center of intellectual light and learning in the spirit of Jesus Christ. And what we have here tonight is that very thing, intellectual light, an attempt to share with one another the good news of this remarkable thing that has happened in Paris after a great tragedy. So, on behalf again of all of us here, both in the cathedral and in the diocese, I want to welcome you to the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine. And now I'd like to introduce to you Bénédicte de Montlort, who is the CEO and the president of the World Monuments Fund, and is, in a way, just like we at the cathedral are, the host of this evening's event.
Thank you so much, Father Malloy, for this humoristic and inspiring introduction. It's a real pleasure for all of us to be here in such a beautiful and fitting context for our lecture on Notre-Dame. So hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Bénédicte de Montlort, the CEO of World Monuments Fund. And for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, I know my accent and the theme of tonight's lecture may be misleading, but World Monuments Fund is in fact a US nonprofit headquartered here at Rockefeller Center. And we have branches in 6 countries, in France, in the UK, in Spain, Portugal, India, Peru. And our mission is to work with communities around the world to safeguard their irreplaceable heritage. This year is a very special year for us at World Monuments Fund, as we were founded almost to the day today, 60 years ago. And for the past 60 years, our teams all around the world have conducted more than 700 projects in 112 countries. Projects as diverse as Angkor in Cambodia, as the gardens of the Taj Mahal in India, as Le Cloître de Saint-Trophime in Arles, or Kew Gardens in the UK, or here in the US, indigenous site preservation at Bears Ears in Utah. So to celebrate our 60th anniversary, we decided to have this special rock star tour of Notre-Dame around the US. We were in San Francisco 3 days ago, we were in Florida yesterday, and tonight here in New York. So why did we decide to have this special lecture devoted to Notre-Dame? For many reasons. First of all, because what happened at Notre-Dame made it the symbol of why heritage matters. This fire at Notre-Dame, I think, marked all of us. This is one of those moments where we all remember where we were on that day. I remember I was in Louisiana with my family when I saw the first flames bursting out of Notre-Dame. And I think, like me, all of you felt this sense of deep shock and sadness because we felt like it was a part of us that was disappearing. It was this monument to human spirituality, to human creativity. And since then, Notre-Dame's cathedral has kept reminding us why heritage matters, why we cannot take it for granted, why it needs constant care. Notre-Dame also is the most important preservation project of the century. As you're going to hear tonight, it's incredible what happened there. In just 5 years, they led the projects with thousands of workers. They raised $900 million. They developed old techniques. They reinstalled ancient techniques. It's really a feast of human leadership, creativity, and will. Finally, Notre-Dame is the symbol of the strengths of French-American friendship and the strengths of American philanthropy. Out of those $900 million that were raised, the number one nationality, the number one country that gave to Notre-Dame is the US. And for that, I want to thank you all for your generosity. When Notre-Dame reopened last December, we witnessed not just the rebirth of a landmark, but a renewed commitment to the values of heritage preservation. And I want to extend my thanks to our presenting partner to this event, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, of course, and Columbia University's Maison Française. It's a pleasure to work with such incredible partners. So tonight we're going to give you a behind-the-scenes look at Notre-Dame. We're going to focus first on the past, on the history, and we are delighted to have with us Barry Bergdahl, who is going to present to you in a few minutes the long history of this cathedral. So Barry Bergdahl is a Meyer Shapiro Professor of Art History at Columbia University. His broad interests center on modern architectural history. At the Museum of Modern Art, he served as the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design from 2007 to 2013. And there, Barry offered a series of exhibitions on subjects such as Mies van der Rohe, the Bauhaus, Henri Labrousse, Le Corbusier, Latin American post-war architecture, and most recently, Frank Lloyd Wright. And even more relevant for tonight is preparing an exhibition on Viollet-le-Duc at the Graduate Center of Bard that will open in January of 2026. After Barry gives us the introduction on the history of Notre-Dame, we will have Philippe Villeneuve. Philippe Villeneuve, who is the chief architect of Notre-Dame. He developed a passion for medieval architecture and cathedral at a very early age, inspired by the 1979 Grand Palais exhibition on Viollet-le-Duc. After that, he pursued architectural studies at the École de Chaillot and became chief architect for historic monuments in France in 1997. Over his career, he has led restoration projects at incredible landmarks like the Limoges Cathedral, l'Hôtel de Ville de La Rochelle, and le Château de Chambord. In 2013, he was appointed chief architect of Notre-Dame de Paris, overseeing essential restoration work on the spire and masonry before the tragic fire on April 15, 2019. Following the fire, Philippe Villeneuve coordinated emergency efforts to stabilize the cathedral and led its full restoration that we are celebrating today. And finally, Bas Metz is going to take us to the future. Bas Metz is a renowned Belgian landscape architect, civil engineer, and architect. He founded his Brussels-based firm in 2007 and has since completed many international projects ranging from large parks to urban forests. His notable works include the redesign of the public space around Notre-Dame, on which he's working right now, le Parc des Ateliers in Arles, and Tour and Taxis in Brussels. He has received numerous accolades, including the Aga Khan Award for Architecture and the French Academy of Architecture's Urbanism Award. In 2023, he was appointed professor in practice at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. So thank you very much, and I want to invite here Barry Bergdahl. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benedict, and good evening, everyone. It's a little bit daunting to be standing in this position. I'm a professor, so I'm used to more lecturing than perhaps sermonizing, but I have a very, very difficult task tonight. I am the warm-up act to the rock star that Benedict de Montlore and the World Monuments Fund have brought for this U.S. tour to celebrate, but also to understand and to learn from the incredible military campaign, practically, that took place that regave us Notre-Dame on the risk of collapse in April 2019, and then in only 5 years rededicated. We're going to look at that in just a moment. I need to move relatively quickly because I've been given 5 to 6 minutes to cover approximately 1,000 years of history. And Philippe then is allowed to go in a leisurely way to discuss what was an incredibly frenetic activity of 5 years of essentially leading 30 campaigns at the same time to bring us Notre-Dame back. So let me advance to the images, and you'll immediately think you're in an art history lecture hall, but in theory yeah, there we go, oops. Sorry, this is very reactive. We're not going to go through this whole plan, but I want to bring a couple of key points to context, which I think will be very helpful for understanding what is at stake in any restoration, but in particular what was at stake in the complex matter of restoring in the 21st century the Cathedral of Notre-Dame, saved from a fire, and then at the heart of debates that I think we'll return to, whether the cathedral should be restored to what point in its past, or should it in fact include 21st century technologies and 21st century additions. As you can see here on this slide, I have said that there are 3 critical centuries, or 3 critical moments, I should have perhaps written, in Notre-Dame's history. The nearly just over 100 years from 1163, when the Bishop of Paris, Maurice de Sully, decided that he wanted to replace an earlier building of the Church of Saint Etienne that was on the site. In fact, this had been a site of religious practice almost since the beginning of Christianity in France. But in 1163, the great urbanization of many French centers, and of course Maurice de Sully, those who know about him know that he was very close to the throne. So this connection of throne and altar that also made Notre-Dame already from the Middle Ages something that was associated with the consolidating French state. But of course, in that century, Notre-Dame became, for Europe-wide, something of a miracle of Gothic architecture. And so how moving to speak in a neo-Gothic building about this miraculous ability to create a space that was so tall and so light-filled that it in fact gave invitation to think about the unthinkable, to think about heaven through its architecture and through its extraordinary technical act of achieving great height, but yet flooding the space with light, filling the the masonry with large panels of glass that are as miraculous today as they were for those who encountered them when the building finally achieved completion in 1265. Achieved completion, this is an extremely important point for us because, in fact, the building was under not only long-term building campaigns, but modifications and changes. And so if we were to spend the next hour decoding the various colors of how the cathedral was built, moving from the apse, moving from the east end to the west end. Actually, the same thing happened in this space here in this cathedral, which is still incomplete. By the middle of the 13th century, the west towers are completed, but by then there are modifications, as you can see by the blue at the east end, as the chapels are extended, the flying buttresses are rethought, and the building becomes ever more daring. So when the building falls into moments of disrepair, even disrespect, as we're going to see in a moment, how do you bring it back? Do you bring it back to 1163, to 1265, to some intermediate stage? Every act of restoration involves a decision about what is the history that is being recovered. I think we so all love Notre-Dame. Some of you may have already made the pilgrimage back to see what has been achieved in bringing this monument back from near collapse. Others are probably planning trips to Paris and trying to figure out how they can join the line of the thousands of people who are going in each day. That we forget that there were long periods of time when Gothic architecture was considered barbaric, when it was considered bad taste, when it fell into disrespect. In fact, the name Gothic itself was given as an act of disrespect. It was the Goths, those who had sacked Rome, had founded this architecture. And I think we see something of that, of a kind of ambivalent attitude in these two slides that I've chosen, one that represents the 17th century and one that represents the very beginning of the 19th century. On the left, you see the period of Louis XIV. Louis XIII and Louis XIV, these great Bourbon monarchs, had adopted Notre-Dame in a further alliance of throne and altar. When Louis XIII took a vow in a critical moment in a battle with Spain, so geopolitics as well, to devote his kingdom to Our Lady, to Notre-Dame, to the Virgin. And from that time on, the Cathedral of Notre-Dame, in what had by then emerged as the capital city of Paris, was of extreme importance. And so the tradition was started to offer a huge painting every year. They were called the May paintings because they arrived on the Feast of the Virgin, the 1st of May. And you see them there all installed by the time that quite a number of them had accumulated in the reign of Louis XIV. But if you pay attention to them, the other thing that they're doing is that they're hiding the Gothic detail and trying to classicize the interior of the building, to bring it up to taste and in some way to obscure this Gothic or barbaric architecture. To such an extent that, of course, under the Revolution, when the church was abolished in France, Notre-Dame was turned into a temple of reason, very much altered in its form. The statues of the ancient kings of the Bible, thought to be actually portraits of the kings of France, were removed. And by the time Napoleon not only returned the practice of the church and began to return church properties to sacred use, including his decision to have himself or to coronate himself in Notre-Dame. You don't recognize Notre-Dame on the right, I don't think, because he has had his architects Percier-Fontaine encase the Gothic piers in classical form, and so they stood for quite a number of years. So Notre-Dame, in a sense, at once politically important but neglected, to such an extent that by the early 19th century, the building was in very, very poor state of repair. Not only weather, the revolution, the ages, but a lack of interest in Gothic architecture until the Romantic movement began to say that Gothic architecture represented spirituality, it represented French genius. The Gothic was the ultimate French expression. Much of this motored by the very popular book, Victor Hugo's Notre-Dame de Paris, the first novel ever to take a building as its main protagonist. And Victor Hugo called very adamantly, joined other voices for the restoration, the salvation of Notre-Dame that was on the risk of collapse. As you can see in the engraving on the left, which is an early 19th century engraving, by the end of the 18th century, Notre-Dame had lost its spire. So there's no spire over the crossing. You see an old drawing of what had been there. You see one of the invention of photography, very important for restoration. we see a daguerreotype of about 1840, and you can see the state of the building. If you look at what are the row of small arches above the three main portals, all of the statues of the kings are gone. Much of the other decorative sculpture has been hacked off the building to give it a more simple profile and to take away things that might fall into the street. The central door has been opened wide for royal passages, taking out the Gothic trumeau, and of course the spire is missing. These were important documents when it was decided in 1842 to hold an architectural competition for the restoration of Notre-Dame. We must say that one of the most important things to come out of the Romantic movement, very important for us in the 1830s, is the conceptualization of the idea of a historic monument. The idea that some buildings speak of history even more loudly than others, and that they deserve to be protected by the state. So the French government had set up a state office for the protection and the restoration of modern buildings. The competition was won by a figure whose name you'll hear over and over again today. You see him there as an old man, but he actually won this competition quite young. Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc on the right. His drawing on the left is the one that won him the competition, and he used, in fact, these new photographs that had just been taken of the existing state. And if I were allowed to dwell for length, we could see all of the decisions that he needed to make in order to, as he said, bring Notre-Dame back so that it could speak loudly of its former glory. He would replace the trumeau, he would recarve all the statuary that was missing, but most importantly, as you can see in this drawing, which you can see in our exhibition next January for real, the spire is going to be replaced over the crossing. Viollet-le-Duc had This poses a very interesting question for us. I've just made you understand that I hope that Notre-Dame evolved over a very long period of time. There were changes that took place. Viollet-le-Duc needs to decide to what state in the past is he going to restore the cathedral. Is he going to imagine a perfect, ideal medieval cathedral like the one on the left, or is he, which is his own imagination of the perfect Gothic cathedral, an amalgam of many features from all of the great Gothic cathedrals of the Ile-de-France, or is he going to decide on a particular moment? In other words, is he going to have a unity of style in his restoration, or is he going to allow some of the changes to speak about a historic monument as having palimpsests of change over time? Unity of style versus a building that narrates a history will be part of his challenge. If the 19th century had invented the idea of the historic monument, the 18th century had already given a key idea, which was the idea of freeing up monuments from dense urban fabric. So you can see here, in the middle of the Second Empire, in about 1865, I would guess, this photograph, Viollet-le-Duc has largely finished his restoration of the cathedral. The statuary is back in place. He's consolidated flying buttresses that were weak, and he has, most importantly, built a spire 2 times higher than the one that had disappeared in the 18th century. I think he did it so that the Gothic cathedral would dominate the skyline of Paris, defeating the neoclassical dome of Soufflot's Pantheon there in the background, that Notre-Dame again would be the center of Paris. Indeed, of course, all mileage in France is measured from the North Tower of Notre-Dame. So that photograph also shows us this idea of freeing up urban space. We're going to talk in a little while about the reconceptualization of the parvis, the square in front of Notre-Dame. This had not always been the case. Here you see this clearing of urban fabric so that a historic monument has a frame of space around it. Much as a picture has a frame to say what lies inside is a work of art, a building should have a frame of urban space around it so that we can stand back and appreciate it and say, this building is a work of art. It's a historic monument. So just one detail we can see very prominently if you try to compare the left and the right here. I don't have a pointer, but look at the place where the transept, kind of where we're standing here, meets the nave and the choir, and you can see that Viollet-le-Duc has changed the elevation from a 3-part elevation in the last 3 bays there to a 4-part situation. He believed that that had been the original design, and that perhaps after a fire, Philippe, I think, doesn't think this fire ever took place. Viollet-le-Duc was convinced it had. But most interestingly, he decided to rebuild this 12th century form so that the nave tells the story of that change from the 12th to the 13th century. It shows, in a certain sense, the evolution of the wonders of Gothic structural design. So Vialet-le-Duc moving back and forth between the perfect cathedral and the cathedral that tells the story of Gothic architecture as a heroic story of invention and continuous experimentation. So much did he believe this that after he had embedded himself in the cathedral he had a longer time than Philippe, he was at work there for almost 20 years, he began to think he could speak Gothic, and therefore he could add those elements that were missing to make the cathedral even more splendid. So we all love to buy the postcards or take shots of the famous gargoyles, these monsters. They are completely a Vialet-le-Duc's invention, although there is evidence that they had existed. Likewise, he recarved much floral ornament. Many, many details are 19th century. Perhaps most dramatically, and you'll see this, and they've been beautifully cleaned in the recent work, Vialet-le-Duc believed that in the Middle Ages, and he was not wrong, that cathedrals were often painted in the interior, particularly in the chapels for devotions at the altars, and that they had very rich paintings, floral, decorative, often imitating fabrics, and that they were an explosion of color, not bare stone. And so he had painted up all of the chapels of both the nave and the east end of the ambulatory, the various chapels, much as a plan like this cathedral. And they had partly been destroyed when Vialet-le-Duc fell into disfavor in the 1960s, and the modernists removed all the paint in the nave, but those in the apse were retained, and they have now been cleaned again. So I wanted to close by saying, one more slide I want to show you, that Philippe was left with the decision, second great period of Notre-Dame. The building is as much a monument of the Middle Ages as it is of the reappreciation of the Middle Ages in the 19th century. Of course, the third great moment in its history is the one that we're going to hear about in just a second. And so to conclude, because we're going to talk about the treatment of the landscape surrounds of Notre-Dame, here are Vialet-le-Duc's projects, a photograph taken as his work was getting underway on the left, and two of his drawings for a way of clearing up space and making an episcopal complex with Notre-Dame, planting a park behind, creating a great, as you can see in the lower image, if you look to the tower end of the west end of the cathedral, creating a great square in front of the cathedral. So the idea that the cathedral would be an urban destination with promenades around it and sufficient space to say, aha, here is a great monument of the Middle Ages. But I'd like to propose that it's also a great monument of the 19th century, and thanks to Philippe Villeneuve, a monument that we can again appreciate in the 21st. So I have to hand over to superstar Philippe Villeneuve, who's going to take us more slowly through 5 years of the Renaissance of Notre-Dame.
Well, I just begin for a few words in English, but it's more serious. Then I continue in French with my translator just near me. So I want to say you thank you to be interested by this cathedral, because without the interest of the American for the reconstruction, perhaps I couldn't success this restoration in 5 years. So thank you for all Americans, and thank you for you to be here. Maintenant, je vais parler français.
Now I'll begin to speak in French.
Et voilà. J'ai pu restaurer la cathédrale en 5 ans parce que j'étais entouré d'une équipe constituée d'architectes, d'ingénieurs, de bureaux d'études. Et vous avez ici la photographie de la famille des architectes.
I would not have been able to achieve the restoration of the cathedral in 5 years had I not had this wonderful group of people that I worked with. It was comprised of architects, engineers, craftspeople, and all of us worked together to make this restoration possible.
Les travaux que nous avons menés à Notre-Dame étaient divisés en 2 parties. La première, la sécurisation, la seconde, la restauration. La sécurisation a suivi immédiatement l'incendie et a duré 2 ans. La reconstruction et la restauration a duré 3 ans, et nous avons donc achevé ce chantier en 5 ans et 8 mois.
The actual restoration took place in two parts. The first part consisted in securing and making the cathedral safe so that we could continue to do the work of the restoration. This part took approximately 2 years. The second part was the actual restoration work itself, which took place over the course of 3 years and approximately 8 months. So all total, the entire restoration process, beginning with making it safe and then carrying out the work, took 5 years and 8 months.
Ici, vous avez ce que j'ai découvert le lendemain de l'incendie, le 16 avril 2019, depuis la tour nord de la cathédrale. Et vous voyez cette énorme structure d'échafaudage qui est ce qui reste du chantier qui avait été entamé juste avant pour la restauration de la flèche.
The photos that you see here were taken the day after the fire took place, which was on April 16th. And you will see that there is a structure of scaffolding. This scaffolding was already in place because we had begun work earlier on restoring the spire to the cathedral.
Et vous pouvez voir à votre gauche, en bas, les charbons de la charpente de la nef, puis un trou de la voûte du transept, et au milieu, l'intérieur de la cathédrale avec un énorme trou de lumière qui est le trou sur la voûte occasionné par l'effondrement de la flèche.
And on the bottom of this slide, you will see pictures of various aspects of the cathedral. On the left, you'll see the actual vaults as they appeared carbonized, basically, by the fire. You'll also see that in the center, there's a large hole with light, and this is where the spire fell through and broke through into the nave of the cathedral.
Là, vous avez 3 vues de l'intérieur de la cathédrale au lendemain de l'incendie. À gauche, vous pouvez voir les 3 destructions de voûtes occasionnées tant par la flèche. À gauche, c'est le sommet de la flèche qui est tombé sur la voûte de la nef. Au centre, la base de la flèche qui s'est effondrée sur la voûte de la croisée, qui a écrasé d'ailleurs l'autel et le sol de la cathédrale. Puis, l'autre trou qui a été occasionné par la destruction de la charpente de Viollet-le-Duc.
In here, you're going to see 3 stages of the damage that was caused when the spire fell. On the left, you'll see the hole that was caused when the spire itself came through and broke through the crossing vault. In the center, you'll see the remains of the vault, which were crushed when the base of the spire actually fell through. And on the right, you'll see the damage that was caused when everything else collapsed.
Au centre, vous avez une photo assez symbolique qui montre les bois calcinés de la flèche sur les voûtes, les maçonneries des voûtes qui ont écrasé l'autel, mais surtout, vous voyez surgir la statue blanche intacte de la Vierge Marie, qui est le symbole de Notre-Dame. On l'appelle d'ailleurs Notre-Dame de Paris. Et à droite, vous avez une photo de la nef avec les bois de la flèche qui sont tombés directement au pied des piliers. Et si l'on regarde attentivement, 2 de ces piliers sont calcinés, sont brûlés. Si ces 2 piliers s'étaient affaissés, la moitié de la nef de la cathédrale tombait au sol.
In the center photo is really a very symbolic photo because if you look very carefully at the damage that was caused when the base fell through into the nave, you'll see the statue of the Virgin Mary, and who is, of course, the patron saint of the cathedral. And the statue is still standing amidst all of the carbonized material that's on the ground. In the photo on the right, you see all of the debris that's near these 3 pillars. These 3 pillars had become so hot as a result of the fire that they had become very fragile. And if at any moment these pillars had compacted and crushed in on each other, the entire structure would have fallen.
Juste après, il y a eu également des consolidations provisoires et vous pouvez voir dans le cadre bleu une partie d'un des murs qui a été fragilisé par l'incendie. Ce gable risquait de tomber, celui-ci, dans le jardin, mais celui de l'autre côté, dans la rue du Cloître, qui longe la cathédrale, sur lequel il y a des habitations, des immeubles et évidemment des passants. Donc nous avons consolidé ce gable avec une charpente posée sur un plancher dont on voit les poutres sur la photographie du milieu.
In the photograph on the left, the part that's enclosed by the blue square is one of the gables, and you can see some of the damage. It had become extremely fragile as a result of the fire, and there was a tremendous risk that it would collapse and fall. If it had fallen on one side, it would have fallen into the garden area of the cathedral. If it had fallen the other way, it would have fallen onto buildings, because there is in fact a street with housing and buildings right on the other side. So this gable had to be reinforced. And if you look at the photo in the center, you will see the structure that was built to help support this very fragile gable and prevent it from falling in either direction.
Et enfin, en bas à gauche, une structure a été posée, légère, en poutrelle métallique et en bâche en plastique, pour protéger les voûtes de la pluie. L'incendie a eu lieu le lundi, cette structure a été achevée le vendredi, et le vendredi soir, il a plu.
If you look in the photograph on the lower left, you'll see a very light structure that has a very large plastic tarp over the top. This was erected so that the vaults themselves would be protected. And we had this constructed by the afternoon of Friday. The fire itself took place on Monday. On Friday, we put this structure to protect the area, and on Friday night, it began to rain.
The first miracle. Ici, vous avez les vitraux des parties hautes de la nef et du chœur qui sont déposés par une armée de maîtres verriers. Puis, plus surprenant, un robot qui a été utilisé pour évacuer les pierres et les bois, tous les vestiges au sol. Car il était interdit, j'avais interdit à toute personne de passer sous les voûtes, car on ne savait pas s'ils allaient tomber ou non. Donc ce sont des robots qui ont dégagé tous ces vestiges.
In the photograph on the left, you will see the actual dismantling of the stained glass windows in the upper nave. And you can see the workers who are working on platforms to be able to remove them. If you look in the center photo, the image is one of a robot. It's the yellow machine that's right in the middle. And I insisted that we use this robot to help remove the debris, the wood and the metal, that was really quite dangerous. I did not want to put any of the workers who were working on this at risk, and so we used the robot in place of humans.
Une cathédrale gothique, c'est une architecture dynamique. Autrement dit, vous avez des poussées, des poids, des contrepoids. Et lorsque un des éléments est déstabilisé, tout peut avoir des conséquences sur l'ensemble. Les arcs-boutants que vous voyez ici, il y en a 28 autour de la cathédrale, ont été bloqués par des charpentes en bois pour qu'ils ne poussent pas les murs si les voûtes tombaient au sol. Heureusement, les voûtes ne sont pas tombées, donc ces cintres n'ont pas servi à protéger la structure. En revanche, ils vont me servir dans quelques mois pour reconstruire certains d'entre eux.
In the photograph on the right, you see something that's very characteristic of Gothic architecture. It's the idea of parts of the cathedral being a weight and a counterweight. And in this, you have the flying buttress, which is the counterweight to the pressure that's being put on it by the buttress. And in total, there are 28 of these surrounding the entire cathedral. And the idea was that anytime there was movement, because this is a very dynamic form of architecture, that these movable buttresses would be able to protect the vaults from collapsing. Well, it actually didn't work that way in this case, but in the end, it actually served a very good purpose because we were able to see how they were constructed and to be able to rebuild them in the same way that they had been built originally.
Je vous ai parlé au tout début de l'énorme carcasse de l'échafaudage de la croisée, posée pour restaurer la flèche. Cet échafaudage a été conçu pour ne reposer que sur les murs et non pas sur la charpente du toit ni de la flèche. Lorsque la flèche a basculé ou lorsque la partie basse s'est effondrée, l'échafaudage a certes été déformé, il a brûlé, il a été tordu, certains tubes se sont soudés, mais la structure est restée en place. Or, il fallait absolument évacuer cette structure. Et c'était très, très dangereux. C'était la chose la plus dangereuse de ce chantier. Et nous avons travaillé de jour comme de nuit, et avec des échafaudeurs et des cordistes, nous avons pu évacuer cette structure. Et à droite, en bas, vous avez la croisée du transept dégagée de toute structure. Et là, nous avons pu commencer la restauration.
I spoke to you earlier about the fact that there was scaffolding that was standing prior to the fire. And when this scaffolding was erected by being attached to the walls. It was not attached to the floors or to any other part of the building. So as a result of the fire, it had become distorted, it had become damaged, but it hadn't collapsed. And it was very necessary for us to remove this scaffolding if the restoration was going to take place. But because of the fragility of the actual structure of this scaffolding, we had to work very carefully. We had experts who helped us to very carefully remove it bit by bit so that we were able to begin the restoration work. And now I'm going to move to part 2, which is the actual restoration.
La cathédrale, ensuite, à l'intérieur, s'est remplie d'échafaudages et c'est devenu une cathédrale d'acier. Et lorsque vous rentriez dans la cathédrale, vous aviez peine à distinguer les murs et les voûtes qui avaient disparu derrière cette forêt d'échafaudages.
The actual interior during the restoration was all scaffolding everywhere from floor to ceiling. It was, in fact, a cathedral of steel scaffolding, where it really became impossible to distinguish between the walls, between the vaults, because it was everywhere.
De même que pour les cintres, les arcs-boutants, nous avons placé des charpentes de bois sous les voûtes pour pouvoir les soutenir en cas d'effondrement, mais aussi pour pouvoir les restaurer. Et vous voyez sur les photos en bas les formes, les poutres de bois qui vous donnent la forme de la voûte disparue.
And we also, as I mentioned before, we used the design of the buttress, the flying buttress and the vaults as a way of helping us to keep things in place, but also to know how to rebuild them. If you look at the pictures on the bottom, you'll see the actual beams of the wood that are going across and that are being used to support the structure above.
Et il est très important de rappeler que nous avons bénéficié de relevés très précis de la cathédrale en nuages de points en 3 dimensions que nous avons pu avoir grâce à Andrew Talon, qui est un architecte et un chercheur américain qui est décédé peu de temps avant l'incendie, et nous avons pu bénéficier de ce relevé pour pouvoir reconstruire exactement la cathédrale telle qu'elle est. Donc j'en profite pour lui rendre hommage ce soir.
We were actually very fortunate to be able to have a very detailed report all of the specifications of the cathedral as it had been. This was the result of some very good research work by an American architect and researcher who helped us considerably when the time came for us to restore things exactly the way they had been, because we had the measurements precisely down to the millimeter.
So we begin the reconstruction, excuse me.
And now the construction begins.
Oups. La cathédrale a été certes détruite, abîmée, mais aussi polluée. Alors les destructions ont été importantes, 3 parties de voûte, la couverture, la charpente et la flèche. Tout le reste est intact, mais la pollution du plomb est entrée absolument partout.
One of the first problems we had to deal with in the restoration was the fact that there was contamination, lead contamination, because of the, in many places, in the vaults and the pillars. And so this first had to be removed in order to make it safe to actually work on the restoration.
Et nous avons utilisé le latex, entre autres, que nous avons appliqué sur les murs, sur les voûtes, sur les marches, partout dans la cathédrale, ce qui représente 44 000 mètres carrés de surface couverts de latex. On va traduire les mètres en feet pour que vous compreniez.
So our solution was to cover everything with latex. And we covered everything, the floors, the vaults, the pillars. And we estimated that it was approximately 44,000 square meters, or about 55,000 square yards of latex.
Thank you. Ensuite, nous avons restitué la charpente en bois. C'est une décision que le gouvernement français a prise après que nous ayons proposé le projet. Nous avons pu restituer exactement la charpente médiévale telle qu'elle était grâce à un relevé extrêmement précis de tous ces éléments, dimension des poutres, détail des assemblages, et nous avons pu restituer cela non seulement en bois, mais avec les mêmes outils qu'au Moyen-Âge. Et vous voyez en bas un charpentier utilisant la doloire, qui est une hache, pour tailler la poutre en suivant le fil du bois, la fibre. Ça va être difficile à traduire.
The decision was made, and this was made with the support of the French government, that we would restore the medieval wooden framework for the cathedral. And we also decided that in order to be able to do so, we would want to use the same tools that had been used by the workmen who were building it originally in the medieval period. And so if you look at the photograph on the lower right, you will see a carpenter working with a very large axe. This type of axe was commonly used in the medieval time to cut wood for this purpose.
Et ici, vous voyez la forêt et la charpente médiévale restituées de manière authentique. Quand j'ai la chance de me promener dans cette charpente, je suis heureux parce que je n'ai pas l'impression qu'il y a eu un incendie. C'est un travail formidable qui a été exécuté par les compagnons charpentiers.
And here, this is an interior view of what we call the forest. And it's a very authentic restoration. It really goes down to the exact details of what the original looked like. And I felt myself when I walked through it almost as if the fire had never taken place. It was so much like the original.
Là, vous avez ici les différentes étapes de la reconstruction de la flèche de Viollet-le-Duc, chef-d'œuvre de charpente, génie de l'architecture et du gothique. Et Viollet-le-Duc a construit une flèche dans le style du XIIIe siècle, tout en étant un architecte du XIXe siècle. Mais il n'a pas fait une charpente Napoléon III. J'aurais pas dû dire ça.
And here are photographs of the different stages of rebuilding the spire. The spire was, of course, from the era of Viollet-le-Duc, but what was part of his genius was that he was able to create this 19th century spire, but in the style and in the spirit of what had originally been the 13th century Gothic sensibility.
Et là, vous avez ensuite la couverture et tous les ornements en plomb qui ont été fidèlement restitués.
And here you can also see how everything that had been, where the covering had been removed, all of the coverings were, the roof and the ornamentation were restored as they were originally done by Viollet-le-Duc.
À l'intérieur de la cathédrale, Barry vous en a parlé, Viollet-le-Duc avait restitué un décor dans les chapelles. Il faut savoir que Viollet-le-Duc a été détesté depuis sa mort jusque dans les années 1980. En 1980, au moment du centenaire de sa mort, on s'est aperçu en France que c'était un génie. Malheureusement, dans les années 60, les décors que vous voyez ici, qui étaient également dans les chapelles de la nef, ont été piochés. Aujourd'hui, nous avons restauré les décors des chapelles, du déambulatoire autour du chœur, et c'est devenu la marque de la restauration des décors de Viollet-le-Duc.
As Barry already mentioned, Viollet-le-Duc wanted to restore the original coloring and the original painting style that had been part of the 13th century cathedral. And Viollet-le-Duc is someone who, following his death, became totally a despised figure. He was not held in very high esteem, and to the point where in the 1960s, a lot of the parts that he had colored the way they originally were painted over or destroyed. And it was only really in the 1980s that once again he began to be accepted and appreciated for his work.
Petite étape, nous avons également restauré les statues de la flèche de Notre-Dame. La particularité, c'est que sur les deux photographies de gauche, vous voyez la flèche juste après son achèvement, et vous pouvez constater que la couleur de la flèche est grise, mais les statues qui sont au pied de la flèche sont noires. À droite, une photographie de la flèche il y a 10 ans, où les plombs de la couverture sont noirs, mais les statues sont vertes, dues à l'oxydation. Nous avons donc restauré ces statues, et voilà ce que ça va donner.
In the photograph on the left, you can see, we're going to now talk about the restoration of the statues on the spire. The photograph on the left is a photograph of the spire with the statue taken at the time of its creation, of its original building. In the photograph on the right, you'll see what it looked like approximately 10 years ago. The difference that you can see very easily in both photos is that in the photo on the left, the actual statue itself appears brown, but there is a sense of green on the spire. On the other hand, on the oxidized version, which is the 10-year-old version, you'll see that now the spire itself is black, and the statue now is green, which is a result of the oxidation.
Et là, je ne résiste pas à vous rappeler, à vous apprendre peut-être que la statue que vous avez à gauche devrait vous rappeler quelque chose à vous, New-Yorkais. Il s'agit d'une des statues de la flèche qui part pour une restauration, mais si vous regardez bien la structure, si vous regardez bien son aspect, ça devrait vous rappeler la statue de Miss Liberté à l'entrée du port de New York. C'est très simple, le sculpteur avait demandé à Viollet-le-Duc d'être l'ingénieur et d'en faire la structure. Viollet-le-Duc est mort entre-temps, et c'est Gustave Eiffel qui finalement a donné la structure nécessaire à la réalisation de la sculpture de Bartholdi, qui désormais nous accueille à New York, dans le port.
And I think this is a story that all of you New Yorkers will appreciate. If you look at the statue on the left, it should remind you of something, the statue of Lady Liberty. It was the sculptor Bartholdi who actually contacted Viollet-le-Duc and asked him for his help in creating the statue, which of course was a much bigger venture than the statue that appeared on the cathedral. And unfortunately, between the time that the project started for Bartholdi, Viollet-le-Duc died. And so Bartholdi then called upon Gustave Eiffel to help him do the engineering that would make it possible to make a statue the size of the Statue of Liberty. But this is his origin.
Et là, vous avez la statue de Viollet-le-Duc, l'architecte qui s'est représenté au pied de sa flèche, en cours de restauration, puis restaurée. Les deux premières photos. La photo de droite, c'est une tradition dans les chantiers médiévaux de laisser 2-3 petites traces, des petits signes, des petites plaisanteries. Je me suis permis, puisque Viollet-le-Duc est la seule statue des 12 apôtres qui regardent son œuvre, eh bien de me faire figurer au sommet de la flèche, juste au-dessus de lui. Et avec la main sur la tête, je rends son salut à Viollet-le-Duc. Et cette tête, même si c'est la mienne, représente tous les compagnons qui ont rebâti la cathédrale sur les pas de Viollet-le-Duc. Et j'espère que Viollet-le-Duc, quand il reprendra sa place, ne me grondera pas, et pour être poli, et j'espère qu'il sera fier du travail que nous avons accompli.
And I just couldn't resist doing this. This is the photos of the restoration of the statue of Viollet-le-Duc. You can see the two photographs on the left show it at various stages of its restoration. But then I really couldn't resist what I then did. This is something that's really part of the tradition of this kind of building that goes back all the way to the medieval era, where those who are working on a project would put some little image or some little trace of themselves into the work. And if you look, you can see that I put my own head on just below the spire, and I'm looking down towards the statue of Viollet-le-Duc, who is looking up. And I like to think that this is something that wouldn't have really annoyed him, and in fact that maybe he would have liked it, and also that he would have been proud of the restoration work that all of us who were working on this restoration project were able to accomplish.
Je passe rapidement, voici des exemples de nouvelles sculptures que nous avons dû refaire après l'effondrement de la voûte de la croisée.
I'm now going to show you some pictures of some of the new statues that we created. On the left, you'll see in the cross vault some of the statuary.
I go quick.
And this
Faster.
is faster. And this is the stained glass windows.
After the stained glazes, the great organ, the chapels with paintings, the monuments, and the May, les peintures dont parlait.
The two photos in the center, the paintings,
Marie
these
tout
are
à
called
l'heure.
Mays, and they were actually paintings that were given to the cathedral by the guild that had worked on various guilds. And since May is the month of the Virgin Mary, it was representations of the Virgin Mary.
Et enfin, nous arrivons à la fin de cette aventure. La nef, juste après l'incendie, avec les trous dans la voûte, et à droite, la nef reconstruite. Et je suis très heureux parce que vous ne verrez jamais la différence entre les voûtes qui ont résisté et les voûtes qui ont été reconstruites.
And finally, to just give a summation in two photographs, you'll see the photograph on the left, which was the vault right after the nave, right after the fire, and then the right with the restored vaults. And I like to think that it's virtually impossible to detect which were the original ones which had resisted the fire and which are the ones that we restored.
Pour finir, je vais vous parler d'une toute petite chose, c'est le coq qui était au sommet de la flèche.
And
Il est...
to finish, I'm just going to talk to you about one little detail. It's the cock that was at the very tip of the spire.
Il est tombé, la flèche est tombée, mais il a échappé au feu en s'écrasant sur le toit. Je l'ai retrouvé et je l'ai sorti le 16 avril au soir. Et vous le voyez ici tel qu'il est ressorti. Donc je l'ai posé le soir même sur cette pierre.
When the spire fell, the cock actually became separated and flew off, and it crashed into the roof, as you can see in the center picture. And I went and I was able to find it on April 16th, and that's what you see in the photograph on the right.
Et quand vous voyez cette statue, cette sculpture, elle est tellement belle et elle exprime tellement la force de l'incendie, la brutalité de l'incendie, on va dire la souffrance de la cathédrale, que je n'ai pas pu me résoudre à envisager sa restauration.
And as you can see from just looking at it, I think it shows so much about the force and the brutality of the fire and what it meant for the cathedral, what the cathedral really suffered, that I couldn't imagine restoring it.
Alors j'ai dessiné une esquisse de ce coq qui devait transcrire, dire qu'il y avait eu un incendie, que la cathédrale s'était redressée de ses cendres, tel un phénix. Cela peut aussi évoquer l'Esprit Saint qui descend et qui veille sur la cathédrale. Et donc voilà le nouveau coq de Notre-Dame de Paris.
And so what I did was I created a new cock, who's really a sort of a combination of a cock and a representation of a phoenix rising from the ashes.
Oh, je pensais pas que ça marcherait. Beautiful. And vraiment, pour finir, c'est une médaille que j'ai fait frapper pour remercier tous les compagnons et toutes les personnes qui ont travaillé à la reconstruction de cette cathédrale. Vous pouvez y voir le monogramme Ave Maria, mais en réalité, il s'agit de merci à toi. Et sur l'autre face, vous avez le coq et la cathédrale.
And I had a medal struck to commemorate the work that we did on this registration and restoration. And you'll see in the photo on the left that there are the two initials, which are both Ave Maria, but also merci à and toi, which is thank you. And this medal was given to all of the guilds, all of the people who worked on the project to restore the cathedral. And on the reverse side, you will see the cock once again, along with the years 2019-2024.
Et maintenant, après le monument, je vais passer la parole à notre ami Basmet pour les extérieurs et l'aménagement.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a true honor and a real pleasure to show you the project that we've conceived for the, let me see if I can get there. You left some slides, Philip, for me? There we go, thank you. To explain you the project for the redevelopment of the public space and the visitor center. Victor Hugo said that the Ile de la Cité was the cradle of Paris. What's interesting to see is that it kept on changing its form. It changed its dips, as you can see on the east and the west side. It's changed its urbanism. And what we thought is that the cathedral became a kind of privileged witness of a city looking for its form. And when we entered the international competition in 2021, the question we asked ourselves is, what form for the 21st century? How to redefine the public space around the Notre-Dame for a world that's changing, taking into account climate change and taking into account a space where we want not only tourists to come, but also the Parisians to come back. When we started looking more in detail at the public space, we of course noticed the strong east-west axis that was doubled by Haussmann to the north, and that is doubled by the Seine to the south. Again, playing around with space, we noticed that the space in front of the cathedral is as large as the one behind it, creating a very curious trinity of spaces. We tried to resume that in this image, where we also were thinking about the important position of Notre-Dame on an island. You could say like this cathedral, while most cathedrals are standing on a higher ground. So how could we bring back that relationship between the cathedral and the Seine, its river? We drew a very precise cartography of the existing situation to see how we could incorporate the past of the site and then bring it to the future. And for example, the existing plaza in front of the cathedral was not very well defined. We decided to give it a very strong, clear form, as wide, as long as a cathedral. We added some trees to protect it from the busy Rue de la Cité. We looked at the existing trees in front of the Hôtel Dieu and continued them all the way along the Rue de la Cité, Rue du Cloître, to block the winds, the cold winds in the winter. We proposed to renovate the existing squares of gardens around the cathedral. And then we proposed to have a 400-meter long embankment park along the Seine, ending at the tip where you have the monument for the martyrs of the deportation. And finally, we looked at the existing parking garage built in the 70s and not used anymore to transform it into a visitor center. So you have 7 figures that really relate to how Paris is built. It is these figures that give the quality and the continuity of the public space. And so we looked at each of these figures to see how from the past we can make them ready for the future. And for example, here you see how we think of the plaza as a clearing surrounded by trees on all sides. A clearing very fitting in standing in front of a church that's often called a stone forest. The clearing allows us to have trees on 3 sides, which give you shaded areas, much needed during the heat of the summer, while the plaza itself remains open to have that beautiful view on the western facade. We put a lot of thought in the choice of the stone, because it's interesting to see that the stone finally is a thin layer between an unpredictable meteorology and a very rich geology in Paris that helped build the city. Now, it must be said that the word parvis comes from the word paradis, paradise, which comes from the word paradisa, which means a walled garden. And so we like this idea that the walled garden here is walled by trees, and it's a public plaza walled by trees. How do you make a space in front of a building as important as Notre-Dame? We wanted to continue the interior space outside without using the same stones. So we went to measure inside the dimensions of this pattern. We continued the pattern. And then in a very lively discussion with Philippe, I remember very clearly, as you can see in our drawing, we stopped before the facade. And Philippe said, but you continue all the way to the facade. And I didn't dare to touch the facade, so thank you for that support to bring the pattern all the way in. So here you see this very enigmatic checkered pattern, le damier, as we call it in French, which we continued outside, not by using 2 different types of stones, but by using a very special treatment to the stone. We created these little grooves, and then we put them in an alternate position, and it is actually the sun that produces the checkered pattern. And what I like about this is that the spiritual space of the cathedral is extended outside and revealed by an astral body, the sun. So in that sense, the Parvis truly becomes a cosmic space. Now, since I could not plant, of course, on the Parvis itself, we came up with the solution of having a thin layer of water, only 5 millimeters thick, so 1/5 of an inch, that on hot days can be activated and runs down slowly to the cathedral, as my 5-year-old girl is showing you, and immediately creating a drop of 10 degrees of the perceived temperature. This is called evaporative cooling. It's what happens when you go outside on a summer day after the rain. You feel the air freshened by the evaporation of the water. It's rainwater that we store in the former parking garage. We looked at all the different phases, as Barry so well explained, and we're very intrigued by the fact that this initial plaza of the 12th and 13th century was so much shorter than the plaza that we all know today, and wondered how we could bring that back into design of the plaza. And we did that by distinguishing the Petit Parvis with the Grand Parvis. And the Petit Parvis, the small Parvis, is the one that we've realized in anticipation for the opening last year. But what's interesting to see playing around with all these maps is that the Petit Parvis also coincides with the space of the towers, the 2 towers of the cathedral. And so playing with all these spaces, you see that the design is inspired by the dimensions of the cathedral, creating the Petit Parvis in front of it, the main body of the church, and then the planted plaza and the western side of it. Now, as the cathedral is often called a book of stones, livre de pierre, we wondered how the public space could help decipher those monuments, how the public space itself could also become a way of interacting with the monument of Notre-Dame, but also the other monuments. And here you see a schematic representation of that. I will walk you through it. The first element is that the point zero, the 0 point of France, is on the Parvis. It is from which all the distances to all the cities are measured and will have its space on the plaza. A second point that I discovered while working on the project is that there's a very specific point where you see the face, the head of the Virgin in the center of the rose window. The rose window that has a diameter of 9.7 meters, so about 33 feet. And the moment you see that, you cannot unsee it. You understand that the whole building is the aura of the Virgin, Notre-Dame. So we will indicate that point on the plaza for all to discover. Another element we discovered is that it's not only a plaza towards Notre-Dame, but it's also 3 buildings towards the Seine. And there is a point where the distances to these 3 facades are exactly the same, and there we will make a large circular bench. You can really, in a kaleidoscopic way, feel this distance. It's also interesting to notice that both, or let's say all 3 buildings, have 2 towers. And lastly, the positioning of the staircases into the visitor center is very well, very precisely chosen, axed towards the Notre-Dame, one far away on the eastern side of the plaza, where you have the typical view, as we all know Notre-Dame, looking at it from top to bottom. If you go inside the former parking lot, and this was conceived by architects NGA and Grau, they took away the intermediate level of the garage so that you will have a full ceiling height. And from here you'll have a new entrance to the Roman archaeology. You will have meeting rooms, you will have a little cafeteria, and when you go back outside, we positioned the staircase exactly where the 13th and 14th century facade stood, so you're obliged to see the cathedral as it was meant to see it, from the portals to the Gallery of Kings, to the Gallery of the Virgin, to the rose window, to the towers, and finally to heaven. And that's how it was conceived, for you to look up and end with your gaze to the sky. So that view we will have again by the positioning of the staircases. Then we opened these windows into the quay wall to have natural light coming into the visitor center. You can see here that we added trees. We added trees to create a real Parc des Berges, embankment park. We looked at species, climate-resistant species, but also adding quite some oak trees in a reference to the forêt, or the forest, of the roof of the cathedral itself. And here we'll have a very lush park, a lot of shade, but also lawns that we think, we hope, people from Paris will enjoy and will make them go back to this space that they often now avoided and left it to the tourist. The idea is also to make a real tour around Notre-Dame, and not only see the western facade, but also discover the backside, if you like, that I think is as beautiful as the front side, in this kind of walk around the cathedral. Here you see that as much as the western side has changed, the eastern side has changed. There was a grove of trees at some point, a morgue at another, and then after World War II, the memorial was built at the tip of the island. So we looked at all those maps to understand how we could make that relationship better. And it was very telling again to see how Pinguisson, the architect who made this masterpiece of the memorial for the martyrs of deportation, imagined his memorial as the bow of a ship, at the same time facing the Seine and at the same time facing the apse of the Notre-Dame, except that relationship was lost when a very large road was built with parking on two sides, where big tour buses would park. And so we looked at reducing that street. We looked also at the different shapes that the island had taken over time, especially interested in the 19th century shape, and using that to pivot the existing fence towards the Seine and opening up the parvis, or let's say the area between the apse of Notre-Dame and the water. So again, a direct relationship not only with the water, but also with the sunrise, of course, the direction in which the cathedral had been built originally. And so in a sense, by pivoting that fence around the memorial, we create that relationship with the cathedral. You can see that here. And so coming from Ile Saint-Louis, suddenly you will come into the park that is extended on the eastern side of the cathedral. We looked at this in a scientific way, understanding the perceived temperature that we are producing. So today, you would have this situation, a lowered perceived temperature underneath the trees because of the evapotranspiration, a buildup of a heat island in front of the cathedral and in the back of it. We calculated what it would mean if we would not do the project 20 years from now, 2050. And then we looked precisely at how we can channel the winds, the colder winds from the Seine towards the plaza, how we can have more trees to have more shade and more evapotranspiration, and how this thin layer of water that can be activated during the hot days can help reduce the temperature. So at the same time, an idea of making the public space resilient to the changes in climate and making them attractive to both Parisians and the visitors, 15 million estimated visitors. And so from this aerial photograph of the existing situation, I go to the aerial photograph of the projected situation. And in a sense, what we hope to do from this learning from the past is not going back to the past, but going faster into the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we are going to have an extremely quick panel. because our panelists were extraordinary in their presentation. I mean, you can learn more about Notre-Dame for 100 years, I'm sure. But I'm just going to turn to you and to ask you about preservation and the process of preservation. The question, we are here at St. John the Divine, which is unfinished. So the question is, where do you stop? When do you stop? Do you have plans, Father, to finish this cathedral? But for you, Philippe, are you finished? Or are there things that you decided just to leave the way it was? And I will continue with Beth and you, Barry. So, Father.
We don't have plans and we don't have money.
Good fundraising.
We do not have plans to finish the cathedral. A number of people ask if we have plans, but we don't. I can't imagine what it would cost. And at this point, the entire property is landmarked. So for us to expand the cathedral as is intended to be expanded would destroy older buildings on the property. And so that would be a problem for us now. I just wanted to say, I don't know how many people know this, but on the 14th of April in 2019, which was Palm Sunday, we had a fire. And so it was in the Undercroft here. It was paintings that burned, and it filled this room with smoke. And so the entire place had to be cleaned, and it's of course incapacitated our pipe organ until just the beginning of Advent this year. So this is a really great exhibit to have here because it forced us to ask questions about our own vulnerability to fire. Unlike your forêt, everything above the vault is actually modern. It's the only modern construction in the entire building, so it's steel and concrete. So currently, as we don't imagine finishing the cathedral, but we do imagine preserving it. And so the entire Undercroft now has sprinklers. We've determined that these choir pews and stalls really are the only thing in here that could burn. So we're not nearly as susceptible to fire as Notre-Dame. So as I said, we're really concerned about preserving the space more than completing it.
And fire is one of the main threats to heritage. That's the reason why at World Monuments Fund 2 years ago we organized a seminar with 500 firefighters and heritage professionals, because all of us have so much to learn about what happened at Notre-Dame, and installing some very simple systems sometimes can preserve a whole monument. So Philippe, what's next? What did you leave unfinished? Is there anything you left unfinished?
I consider that a cathedral is never finished. Even if you consider that Notre-Dame is a finished monument, naturally you have to have every day, every time, a scaffold on the monument, because it's a good sign. If you have a scaffolding on the monument, it's because you preserve it. And a monument without scaffolding is not a good idea. And I consider that this cathedral is very interesting because for New York, as a European, it symbolizes New York completely, because you have concentrated three periods and one monument in a few time, a very, very short time. You have a Roman, a Byzantino, we don't know, and a Gothical nave. And each part is a very interesting, very amazing architecture, and the totality of this monument is a wonderful monument. And during the speech, I could look at this cathedral and I said me, no, this cathedral must be like it. It's finished. Yes, perhaps a little painting, but just this.
And Bas, I think we were all fascinated because we are talking here about a medieval or a 19th century cathedral, but you definitely transported us to the future with the adaptation to climate change. And this is something that you are very well known for creating those ecosystems. So here too, where do you stop? Where do you go? What do you respect from the past? Like, how did you combine all those elements?
I think in landscape architecture, we never start and we never stop. in the sense that we don't make an object, we try to understand the existing situation, and we try to understand its vocation in a church. Its vocation meaning where does it want to go to, what's the power of nature that will help you get there, and how can you accelerate that process. So in that sense, when we're finished, the real protagonists, which are the plants, take over. So it's never finished in that sense.
So talking about not finished or new things, so you saw the rooster already created by Philippe, but of course there were many debates about, if you remember just after the fire, about creating a modern roof, a contemporary roof on the cathedral. That idea didn't prevail. But now there is a whole new debate about the stained glass of Notre-Dame and a contemporary intervention. So Philippe, what do you think about contemporary intervention in what you call your cathedral?
It's very difficult for me to speak about that because I'm a public servant. You know, I belong to the Ministry of the Culture in France. But I have some ideas, and I can say some ideas. For example, I always say that we had to rebuild the spire as it was because it was the law. It's the same thing for the stained glass, because it's the law, it's classified and protected. But we perhaps...
So that's a heated debate for those of you who don't know in France about contemporary intervention in the cathedral. And you can look at it for now. There is an artist, French, from Los Angeles, that is working on some stained glass. And maybe to finish, Barry, very easy question. How do you look at all of that? You know, this whole restoration, this idea of modern contemporary intervention, what Bass is doing, and what does it tell you about the history of preservation itself? How this idea that you said emerged very strongly in the 19th century evolved over time?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting perception that you're hinting at, which is that preservation has its own history. Viollet-le-Duc is, well, he's everywhere in this building because I think Ralph Adams Cram was a great reader, designer of the nave here was a great reader of Viollet-le-Duc. And Viollet-le-Duc, in his 10-volume dictionary basically on medieval architecture, which he explains beautifully the whole concept of the dynamic monument that Philippe was talking about, also includes a 10-page article on restoration. And the first sentence of that is very interesting. He says, both the word and the thing are modern. And then he goes on to explain that the desire to restore buildings in order to bring back the splendor of their own history is itself a modern sensibility. So this awareness that he is not involved in an act of nostalgia, he's involved in a modern appreciation of making history alive in a way, and that to him is the essence of a historic monument. He was contested by many people. The English, in particular, almost created an entire anti-Viollet-le-Duc movement called anti-scrape. Don't touch our monument, let it age with time. Just keep it standing, but don't restore. So there is, but by the time we get to the Venice Charter, there are certain conventions under which we work now. And when it comes to the recent controversies over whether Notre-Dame could have 21st century interventions given the fire, for me as a historian of the 19th century, and one of the reasons I was so honored to be asked to be part of this was to give Viollet-le-Duc his honor as part of the fabric of Notre-Dame. The problem in 2019 was suddenly the notion was the cathedral is burned, the spire burned down, it's 19th century, we don't need it anymore, it doesn't belong to the cathedral. So I hope that people will leave this evening realizing that the cathedral is a much more complex monument and that one needed to preserve many elements of that history. It doesn't exclude, from my point of view, the 21st century. The problem with the controversy that you can read now about in the newspapers and on the internet about modern stained glass windows is that rather than proposing to put them in places where there are no historic windows, those have been proposed to replace Viollet-le-Duc's windows. So in other words, we have what I think is unacceptable, which is the desire to destroy part of the 19th century fabric to insert the 21st century. But I think Philippe and Bas Metz are both working to really bring the the 21st century in an intelligent and meaningful way into an ongoing monument.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you, because for those of us who have been to Notre-Dame, I think now we want to go back because we've learned so much tonight that we will have a much more enlightened tour. And for those of you who haven't been, I'm sure they can't wait. Thank you all for coming, so numerous. Notre-Dame is definitely a symbol. We never had a Mellon Lecture with so many people. And I really thank you for your interest in historic preservation and in Notre-Dame. The work as Notre-Dame is continuing, so if you want to be a part of it, you can join the Friends of Notre-Dame, and you can also join World Monuments Fund if you want to join and learn more and support our work all around the world, not only in France, but in Cambodia, in Africa, and elsewhere, which is so important, especially today, because through heritage preservation, we promote solidarity between people. We promote respect and mutual understanding and admiration for what each people of the world creates. So thank you again. Thank you to my team, Anjuli, who has created this, Anjuli Revaud, who has created this extraordinary series of conference in 5 days all around the country. It's quite a feast. So, and thank you, of course, to our great partners, Mon Père, here, the Maison Française de Columbia, and thank you, all of you, for joining. Have a good evening. Sorry.
Hello, mes amis. Now, one of the casualties of our fire on Palm Sunday 2019 was our great organ, which, as I mentioned, was only brought back into use on the first Sunday of Advent this year. And now my wonderful colleague, Dan Fakari, a member of our music staff here, and a spectacular organist, is going to demonstrate for you, is going to let you share in our joy whenever this great organ plays. So, Mr. Fakari.